DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi, this is Alex Stein, co-host of Mushing Radio on DogWorks Radio. We just completed our first storytelling season on the 1925 Serum Run. Almost 100 years later, the 1925 Serum Run is something that is still inspirational, amazing, and in many ways larger than life. We've gathered all of these episodes together on one page to make it easier for you to listen to them in order. Just go to dogworksradio.com/serumrun. That's SERUMRUN, no space, dogworksradio.com/serumrun. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to DogWorks Radio at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is that you go to listen to podcasts.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on DogWorks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog, available on DogWorks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto and you're listening to our daily coverage of the 2018 Iditarod here on Mushing Radio. You can find us over on dogworksradio.com as well as over on KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley up here in Alaska. And I am joined tonight by my co-host calling in from Southern California. His name is Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. I was, this afternoon, I was drinking Alyeska spiced tea out of an Alaskan coffee mug and felt a little bit more connected with Alaska. Sad not to be there, especially not to be in Nome when the winter came in. And as we said last night, it was the first time in 7 years that the winner of the Iditarod has not been named Seavey.
I saw that. That is amazing stat right there. You know, not only do they have a dynasty going on, but they have to have one heck of a good pack of dogs to choose from. Before we get into that, do you know how Dallas is doing over in the Finnmark Slopet?
Last time I checked, he was in first place, which is kind of ironic that we have an American in first place over in Norway and a Norwegian who wins the Iditarod.
Right. So tell us a little bit about last night's finish with your Leifsef Olsen coming in as the new Iditarod champion and his first time winning the Iditarod. What do you know about Joar and his finish?
Yeah, he came in exactly at 3 a.m. Alaska time. So 4 a.m. Is that right? 3 a.m.? Yeah, exactly at 3 a.m. Alaska time. So it was 4 a.m. for me, 7 o'clock on the East Coast. And he had 8 dogs in harness. They looked very, very happy. And there were, as always is the case when the winter comes in, there were probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people out on the street. And people were just sort of celebrating him coming in. Didi Genre was there sharing the mic with the Iditarod Insider people and talking about what Joar means to the Iditarod. And there was very much a feeling, I thought, that this represents in some ways a sort of new guard in the Iditarod, a younger generation really stepping to the forefront. Mitch Seavey, the oldest person ever to win the Iditarod, still managed to come in third, which is nothing to sneeze at, is a very, very fine performance. But it really felt like he was not as much of a threat as he had been in the past few years. And even though he was able to hang in there with the top three pretty much all through the race, it never quite felt like this was Mitch's year. And it felt until Nick Pettit took that wrong turn on the ice, it really seemed like this was going to be Nick's time to come in and win the Iditarod. I think he is still kicking himself for this because he gave an interview today where he was adamant about how his dogs were faster all throughout the race, implying that if he hadn't taken that wrong turn, he would have won, which I'm sure he would have. But at the end of the day, these are the sort of things that can turn a race around for one team or another.
And you mentioned that sort of passing the torch or changing of the guard in Iditarod. I read an article the other day from Jeff King saying that, he just can't do it anymore. He can't be up there with the new kids on the block, so to speak. They're just rocking and rolling so fast and doing so well. It really is a difference maker in terms of sort of that who's who of Iditarod. I know Martin Bucer was way back there. Names like Hugh Neff are back there in like 20th place or so the last time I checked. And, Allie Moore and Allie Zirkle, and of course Dee dropped out. And Wade Mars is one of those up-and-comers, but he's also dropped out. So it is a different pack of new mushers coming in, and in particular, names like Jesse Holmes, who is going to win the Rookie of the Year. I think he came in 8th place. But then we also have some those folks that do very well at that top 10 placement. I know Ramey Smith came in, I believe, in 9th place, and he's a very well-known musher up here in Alaska. I don't think he's ever won the Iditarod, but he's came close a couple of times. I think his best finish is 2nd. So it's interesting to have new people, and I think it's really invigorating for the sport. What do you think?
Absolutely. And Jesse and Ramey were 7th and 8th instead of 8th and 9th. But yes, exactly. And, in the rounding out the top 10, we had Joar was in 1st, then Nick Pettit, Mitch Seavey, Ray Reddington Jr., Pete Kaiser, Richie Deal, Jesse Holmes, Ramey Smith, and Travis Beal. And it looks like the number 10 will be Linwood Fielder. So there are some names that people who follow Iditarod will be very, very familiar with. But it also seems like this is a relatively young top 10 compared to how it's been in the past few years. It's interesting that Travis, who took last year off from running Iditarod, was able to come back and finish as strongly as he did. Jesse was really burning up the last few hundred miles of the course. I think when he was in Unalakleet or near Unalakleet, he was closer to 20th place, and he just kept passing people, did extremely, extremely well in the last part of the race. So it really speaks to what you were saying. Jeff King is not, he's not an old man. He's not the oldest person to run the Iditarod, but at a certain point, it really starts taking its toll, and you can still finish well. You can still have an amazing time running Iditarod, but it seems like for some of these racers, their days of being in a position where they might win could be over unless something drastic happens or they just get an amazing dog team.
Right. So, yeah, congratulations to Joar Olsson. I'm sure he and his family are very excited. I'm sure that the country of Norway is very excited as well. Last night we talked a lot about your movie, Mush the Movie, and you had a segment in there about Team Norway and their fans and how excited they were. And it's just interesting to see sort of how a time lapse or even a time capsule about how Iditarod really is a race of nations, isn't it?
It really is. And I feel great about Team Norway winning again, because I first really started getting into the Iditarod and following it in a serious way when Robert Sorley and that Team Norway were so dominant early in the 2000s. And Joar has said in interviews that he started getting interested in dog mushing and in the Iditarod by watching Robert Sorley. And this year, Robert Sorley was on the trail and was around and kind of interacting with some of the Norwegian mushers at some of the checkpoints. So it was really great to be able to, in a way, have that additional passing of the torch and that generational handoff between the Robert Sorley Team Norway and the Joar Olsum Team Norway.
Right. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next in the next coming years. I think we will see some new names there, maybe even from different countries outside of the United States. You know, it's been an Alaskan for a long time. It's very difficult for mushers to come up and not only qualify for the races, but also, you know, move their entire operation and their family and everything else to be able to race here on these home trails, so to speak, you know, the trails that the Iditarod runs, because it is quite a bit different than it is in the lower 48 and other places. And I remember back in the day, that was talked about a lot when a man by the name of Doug Swingley came up and really took the race by storm, being that outsider that he was, and, you know, just took charge and did very well from coming up from Montana, I believe.
Yeah, and you know, it's such an exciting thing to watch a team. You know, Yor in particular, in his rookie year, he finished seventh, and he just has been right up at the front of the pack each of the years since then. So to watch that over a relatively short amount of time and watch him become more and more dominant until he won the race has just been a really wonderful thing to see.
Right. So let's move on here. I know you talked about sort of the party atmosphere in Nome when Yor came in at about 3 a.m. Alaska time. I don't think there are too many parties around where you would have 1,000, 1,500 people show up into the streets to revel in some type of sporting event, but they do that in Iditarod, and it's a very interesting scene what happens in Nome over the next, 4 or 5 days or so until the banquet this weekend. Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the things that happens that people may not know about is that when a musher reaches a certain point, and I believe it's approximately 2, maybe 2.5 miles from the finish, the siren goes off. So everyone in Nome, or at least everyone within hearing distance of the siren, and Nome is it's spread out, but there's a lot of people who can hear the siren when it goes off. So the siren will go off, and that's kind of a warning sign that there is about maybe 15 minutes, sometimes a little bit more than 15 minutes until the team will finish. So when people hear the siren, they know that they can, put on their clothing, get all set to be out in the cold, and come out and greet the mushers as they come in. So it's not so much that everyone in Nome is glued to their GPS trackers, or that they, suddenly magically telepathically know, but they get this warning. And then for a lot of them, it's really a tradition to come down, especially with the first few mushers who come in, and cheer them in as they come off of the sea ice up onto Front Street, and then into a chute that's been set up and under the Burled Arch where they finish.
And you mentioned that siren. Didn't a couple of years ago they had a little bit of a hubbub about that? I know that they wanted to cancel that for a while or something, and I guess that's continuing on now, or did they work something out with that?
Yeah, there was a rumor that they were not going to use the siren anymore, or they were not going to use it at night. But I think what happened is the city of Nome and the Nome city government realized that the Iditarod is such an important event and such an important part of their culture that for 4 or 5 days it would be okay to have the siren going off.
Right. And you mentioned last night on our show about some of the events that happen in and around Nome other than mushing. You talked about a golf tournament, and there's, of course, lots of types of things for visitors to do. They can take tours out onto the sea ice and the snowcats and do all sorts of things while they're waiting for their favorite mushers to come in. But it is definitely a party atmosphere. It still has that Old West feel and look to it. It has sort of those false front buildings like you'd see in a lot of Westerns on some of the buildings there. One bar in particular happened to be owned by a very popular person of the Wild West West, and that was Wyatt Earp. Did he own the Gold Nugget, or was that something else? Do you recall?
I'm not sure which one, but he owned one of the saloons there. And there are a lot of saloons in Nome. And at Iditarod time, there are a lot of events that happen in the saloons, and frequently Hobo Jim will come up there and perform in Nome. There are arm wrestling contests, and a couple of years ago, Ali Zirkle was competing against one of the fans and actually broke the fan's arm. And so, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the bars. The bars stay open very, very late. And while I do believe they are officially closed for several hours, it's very much a party atmosphere, and you can pretty much sit in a bar all day if that's the sort of thing that you want to do.
And for folks that are thinking about traveling to Nome in the future, hotel or motel, I guess it would be the case, rooms are very much at a premium. There used to be 3 motels up in the Nome area, and just this year, one of the hotels or motels, I guess it is again, burned down. So there's even less rooms that are available than there was last year. And there are just a few, I guess, bed and breakfast type places, but otherwise it's tough to get a room up there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And a lot of people will rent out rooms or spaces on their couches. And the Nome City Council or the Nome Convention and Visitors Bureau helps sort of match people who are coming up with people who have space in their houses to rent. But as you said, it's totally at a premium. There are people who host mushers, and some of the mushers who've been running Iditarod for a long time have been hosted by the same volunteer families for many, many years. I wanted to mention one other thing about Joar coming in, which is that when he first came to the shoot, his dogs were so distracted by the number of people that were all around that they stopped about 10 or 15 feet short of the burled arch. And Joar had to actually go out and get in front of them and tell them that they had to keep going and get them started again so that they would go and actually finish the race. And that is something that's not that unusual, especially for the winners of the race, because you have to keep in mind that even at the largest checkpoints, these are dogs who are not used to having been around more than maybe a couple of hundred people at a time. So suddenly to be in a crowd where there are more than 1,000 people can be a little bit disconcerting. It's a little bit of an adjustment for them to make after being really alone with just their musher for many, many hundreds of miles, and then in these checkpoints where there just aren't a lot of people for most of the race.
Right. And then getting back to sort of how Nome is set up, you talked about the burled arch. It's interesting to see. A lot of people think that, it's just this snowy atmosphere and everything is covered in a blanket of snow, and that's not necessarily the case. It's right there on, is it Front Street or Front Avenue?
Front Street, yeah.
Front Street. And they have the arch set up on a very large pile of snow, literally a pile of snow in the middle of the road there on Front Street. And then right after that shoot that you talked about, the dogs are led down the road a little bit further to the Nome dog lot, and that's set up in a pretty interesting way. And that's where a lot of the controversy has developed with Dallas Seavey's team last year with the doping allegations and all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the Nome dog lot?
Yeah, it's about maybe somewhere between 50 and 100 yards from the burled arch. It's literally right down the street. It's next to the mini convention center, which is kind of Iditarod headquarters in Nome. And at least in the past, it has been, there have been guards there and it's been secured, but I don't think it's been as highly secured as people want. And there's generally been the assumption that anyone who is there is just there to care for the dogs. And And I think this year, especially after the allegations and what happened with Dallas, it's being patrolled a lot more. They're a lot stricter about who's going to be able to get in to be with the dogs. And I would have to assume that there would be a significant number of security cameras there this year as well.
So I know we're going to talk about this later in the week as we approach the finishers banquet, but that happens this weekend. And for the last several years, the Red Lantern has come in at about the same time of the start of the finishers banquet, which is always great because everybody's off the trail and safe in Nome. One tradition I like to see, and then we're going to move on very quickly because we're running out of time, is there are a lot of mushers that go out and meet and greet everybody that comes in under the arch. I know Lance Mackey did that for a number of years. I know that Newton Marshall was prone to do that as well when he was running, where they go out no matter what time of day, if they can, they go out and congratulate their fellow competitors. That's true sportsmanship in my book, don't you think?
It absolutely is. And I think it speaks volumes about the people who do that. I mean, obviously, by the time people finish the Iditarod, they are completely exhausted. So it's understandable if someone is dead asleep and can't make it out there. But there are a lot of mushers who make a concerted effort to be out there for as many of the finishers as they can. And I think that really speaks to the kind of fraternity of mushers that is celebrated in Iditarod.
One last thing about Nome. I wanted to mention this the other day, but we didn't get a chance about the dropped dogs. I know that this is a really interesting story, but for the majority of the race, dogs are flown back to Anchorage and then taken care of either by volunteers at the Lakefront Hotel in downtown Anchorage, sort of the race headquarters on this side of the race, and then some of those dogs are taken to the women's prison here near Eagle River and taken care of there. And then at some point in the race, I would assume probably once it passes that second, third mark, sort of that unicolete mark, that the dogs are returned to Nome to be picked up and flown home, and then of course eventually make their way to Anchorage. But everything sort of shifts, doesn't it, in terms of trail logistics and all of that at a portion of the race where things are happening 1,000 miles away on the other side compared to here. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's very much a question of logistics because in Nome they have a large enough airport that they can land large planes and jet planes. So in the first part of the race, dogs that are flown back to Anchorage are flown back on Iditarod Air Force planes, which generally are very small planes that maybe can hold 6 or 7 people, and the dogs are put in those planes and brought back to Anchorage. But at a certain point, it makes more sense to bring the dogs to Nome, where there are these split planes that have about a third of the plane devoted to cargo, and you can just put the dogs in crates and put them in a large cargo section, so you can send out dozens of dogs at a time instead of 5 or 6.
Right as well. Okay, let's talk about a couple of quick stories before we jump over to our musher profile of the evening. I know at the time of recording, we're recording at 5:00 p.m. Alaska time on the 14th. There weren't any further scratches today, which is always good. People are making their way down the trail, and I believe it's Steve Watkins and our friend Tara Secatello, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, our musher profile on day 1. There in the very back of the pack. But you have a couple of stories, and one of them is sled dog related, but not necessarily Iditarod related in regards to a loose dog team. What do you have?
Right. So earlier this week, there was a loose dog team that was running along the road in Fairbanks. And there was a driver who just noticed that there was a dog team running along the road, which is not that unusual in that area. But then she saw that there was a sled attached to the dog, but no musher attached to the sled. And it turns out that what happened is that this was a dog team of former Iditarod racer Gwen Holdman. And she said that two of her children were giving a friend a ride in the sled, and she was ahead of them in a what she called a snow moped, which is like a motor scooter on skis. And the sled went over river ice. It skidded. When it hit snow again, it tumbled sideways. The children who were riding in the bag in the sled spilled out, and the sled righted itself, but the musher who was on the back had fallen off. So the dogs, as sled dogs tend to do, just kept running. And she figured that the dogs would stop when they got to a river landing, but the dogs decided that they wanted to keep running, so they made a couple of turns until they were running right next to the traffic. And one of the motorists decided that this was not a good and safe thing to do, stopped her car, and was able to stop the dog team and get them all, safe inside her car until Gwen was able to catch up with them. And the very good news is that no one was hurt. The humans who fell out of the sled were fine, and all of the dogs were fine.
I saw that video of that dog team running down one of the roads there in Fairbanks, and they were just tootling along with the sled behind them. That's a little uncommon to see a sled upright like that. Typically, they will tip over and sort of drag along, and they'll catch on something, and that will stop the team, and sometimes those dogs will tangle up. But there they went, right down one of the city streets, sled attached, but no human in sight. And I think the hashtag or something was only seen in Alaska or something like that. I thought I got a real kick out of that. So the second story is something about Ryan Reddington. What is that about?
So our friends Blair Braverman and Quince Mountain tweeted earlier that the reason that Ryan had to drop out is that at one of the checkpoints he was accidentally given water that had been contaminated with a little bit of diesel. So his dogs had the kennel crud earlier, but they had recovered. He was doing very, very well in the race, but he and the dogs got this water that was not pure water, and so it caused a great deal of gastric distress for everyone involved. The good news is that it was a small enough amount that it worked its way through the systems of the dogs and the humans without causing any permanent damage. But you hate to see something like that, and especially with all of the added scrutiny about possible, interference with dog food and with stuff like that. It's something that, obviously no one wanted to see. And I think there's going to have to be some additional reviews of how water is accounted for at the checkpoints as well.
I wonder if it was just the wrong container that was used. I know that they boil water in the checkpoints, especially these more remote checkpoints, in very large, like commercial kitchen vats. They're huge mixing type bowls where they would hold a couple of 100 gallons or more. I wonder if it just happened to be using a vat or a container system that was used for something else, and it wasn't properly signage or anything like that, where they just, a volunteer or whatever just said, oh yeah, this is an empty container, there's no markings on it, let's just put water in it and all will be good. So yeah, I'm sure there will be some type of investigation, or at least looking into and see what can be ascertained from that. So let's talk about our musher profile for this evening. We've been on the trail for a little over a week and a half. We've covered quite a few mushers up to this point. Most of the mushers that we've talked about are sort of those lesser known type mushers. Who are we talking about this evening?
So this evening we're talking about Anya Rodano, who is also a rookie. We've been talking about a lot of rookies because they're much less well known, and it's fun to talk about the rookies. She is 43, and she's from southern Germany, coincidentally not too far away from where the German part of my family is from. She's from a little bit outside of Munich, and after she went to school, she studied, got a degree in nursing, worked as a nurse for 10 years, and then, as seems to happen a lot with some of the mushers we've been talking about, she had a trip to Alaska. This was back in 2003, and she just absolutely fell in love with the scenery and with the area and with the lifestyle, moved to Alaska shortly thereafter and began working as a handler for Melanie Gould, who was an Iditarod racer. She started her own kennel in 2008. She married Peter Rodano shortly around that time. They live in the Talkeetna area in a very swampy part of Alaska, and so she named her kennel the Swamp Dog Kennel. She has been sort of a recreational musher for about 10 years and decided a few years ago that she wanted to actually get her act together and run Iditarod, started running a bunch of qualifiers, and has a relatively small kennel. She also has gone back to school and is working now as a vet tech. She has volunteered for many years for Iditarod and has gone up the trail. She said that she's had the opportunity to go all the way to Nome as a volunteer for Iditarod, but chose not to because she said that she wanted to wait until she could come into Nome driving her own dog team. She was when Your Olson finished this morning, Didi Genro was talking about some of the up-and-comers in Iditarod, and she mentioned specifically Anya as someone to watch in the next few years. Anya, it has been very much kind of in the not the way back, but in the back of the pack. She's currently in 52nd place. She's out of Unalakleet right now. When she was running the Knik 200 this past January, she was running a team of younger dogs just to see who she would pick to round out her dog team for Iditarod. At the time, she had said that she was seriously thinking of starting with 14 dogs instead of 16, just because she didn't think that the extra power that she would need would be worth the amount of extra food and extra care and extra bootying that would go into having a 16 dog team for 1,000 miles. She changed her mind and did start with 16 dogs, and I think it's a very good thing that she did, given the soft snow and the slow going that it's been for a lot of teams. She is currently, I don't know if I said this already, but she's currently in 52nd place, which is not at the exact end of the pack, but is close to the end of it. And she said that she was very upfront in interviews before she started and said that she had no illusions that she was going to win the race, but that the advantage of being a back of the packer is that because you're not going to win the race, you can spend a little bit more time really appreciating the villages and the scenery. And she seems to be doing very well at the moment. As I mentioned, she's out of Unalakleet. She's still got 13 dogs in harness out of her original 16. So it's very exciting to me to see someone who has been sort of a casual musher for many years to finally make that leap and compete in Iditarod.
Excellent for sure. Yeah, I had never heard of her, at least in terms of Iditarod circles myself. But yeah, I'm sure that she will do very well in the coming years. It seems to be a little easier if folks want to continue running Iditarod after that first one. Not only do they know the trail and they've got all the so-called bugs and jitters out, and the logistics is a little bit easier to control, that they typically do better as they progress in years in terms of Iditarod, which I think is going to be the case with this young lady as well. Alex, do we have a couple more minutes to share some information about Joar Olsson? I talked about it last night, and his visa that he's on here in Alaska and sort of some of the conditions of that.
Sure.
I'm reading right now an article that was published a couple of years ago in the Anchorage Daily News and was posted on one of the mushing pages by our friend Helen Hegener. And it was written in 2016, and it talks about what it cost for a lot of these foreign mushers to come over and compete in Iditarod. And I know some folks just fly over for their qualifiers and eventually do the race, and then they pack up and go home. But Joar Olsson is a little bit different. Last night we talked about how he is here on a visa as an athlete from Norway, and he is listed as on a visa for an individual athlete, very similar to as if they're coming over to train for the Olympics or something like that, and it's capped at a decade. So he's already a couple of 3 years into this 10-year cap, and then once that's up, technically, he's supposed to pack it up and go home at that point. But what's interesting is something that I also talked about last night. With this visa condition, he is unable to earn any type of income or is not allowed to have a job while he's here. And up to this point, of course, he has not won the Iditarod. So all of his earnings went back into a nonprofit that he's part of called Racing Berinja, I believe is how you pronounce it, which is part of the Go North Adventure Learning Program, which is it creates K2, K-12 education plans based on expeditions like the Iditarod. And up until the point before running Iditarod, all of his race winnings had to be filtered back through the nonprofit because he was unable to earn a living while he's here, that I'm sure he was taken care of by the nonprofit with its expenses paid and whatnot, very similar to if somebody was on a board of the Red Cross or the Goodwill or whatever. But I just find it really interesting that he made that sacrifice to come here for 10 years and to set up roots here in Alaska and do the Iditarod and of course end up doing very well, eventually winning the race. But all of that process that it takes, knowing that in 10 years, no matter what life you have set up here in this country, you have to turn around and go home. And pretty much, unless another visa is approved in the future, you may never be able to live here again. It's just interesting to put everything on hold for a decade to come and run this crazy dream of Iditarod, knowing that one day it'll all be over and you have to do something else. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't want to get too political here, but I would hope that the fact that he has shown such a dedication to the sport and such a dedication to living in Alaska would count for something, and there would be some kind of program where he could get a green card or some sort of more permanent official designation. Certainly, this is someone who is a great inspiration for other people who would want to come here and make something of themselves. And I would hope that there would be a way that he could continue to live here if that's what he wants. We've seen other people who started as immigrants. Martin Boozer came over here and then eventually got his citizenship. And I would hope that if that's something that Joar wants to do, that there was a way that he could do that. That was relatively easy. And also, I just wanted to say that you mentioned our friend Helen Hegener, and she runs a number of mushing-related Facebook groups and is just absolutely tireless in posting great articles on them, seemingly all day and night. And really, she's one of the more amazing people that I've met in and around the mushing world, and just am very thankful to her for everything that she does.
You know, I don't know how she does it. I have a hard time just keeping up with this podcast. I can't imagine having 4 or 5 Facebook groups, and I'm sure anybody listening that's part of any type of group, whether it be mushing or otherwise, and just the process that it takes to moderate those groups and to screen out posts and accept invites and do all that stuff that goes behind the scenes. That's a heck of a lot of work, and that's on top of the job that she has. I know she's a professional writer and author, and she does a lot of writing for various publications, always seems to be writing books about here and there, and it's just amazing that she has the time to be able to do that. And she does quite a bit of traveling around Alaska as well. She and her family are very involved sort of in the Alaska scene, so to speak, and I know she travels around and writes about things here and there. She and I met several years ago at the start of the Serum Run expedition, and we got to know each other then and spoke about mushing culture in Alaska and whatnot. So yeah, she is definitely a tireless advocate for the Iditarod, and of course we welcome her input as well. So Alex, anything else on today's show before we go? I know we're over by about 15 minutes, so a little bit longer episode than typical.
No, just that I want to remind people we have the top 10 teams are in now. Linwood Fielder seems to have finished while we were recording this. There's still a lot of teams on the trail, and I'm very happy that we're going to be continuing doing this nightly until the finishers banquet this weekend.
Is that Saturday or Sunday?
I believe it's Sunday, but I'll double check.
Very good. All right, guys. So we look forward to having you with us tomorrow night, and we will talk about the middle of the pack that's coming in. Of course, Iditarod is just churning 24 hours a day, so they're going to be finishing every few hours over the next several days up until that finishers banquet. And I think most of the folks will be in by then if they keep their times up for sure. Hopefully that nobody is under that dreaded Rule 36. And if you don't know what that is, look that up before tomorrow's show. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that rule on tomorrow's program. And again, if you have questions or comments, shoot us a line over on social media. Shoot us a message over on Facebook or Twitter. You can find me at Robert Forto, and you can find Alex at Coldfoot Films. And make sure, if you really like what you hear, subscribe to us over on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review there. It helps us out in our rankings and helps other people find us as well. And with that, Alex, it's always been a pleasure. Have a good evening, and we'll talk tomorrow.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, this is Robert Forto for the 2018 Iditarod coverage here on Mushing Radio. We'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our DogWorks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about DogWorks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
DogWorks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. DogWorks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dog Works at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.